Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
We're doing something a little different
Mhm.
tonight. We're straying from our normal storytelling tonight because we kind of have an exciting announcement.
And this is something we have been talking about for probably 2 years.
Probably, I think halfway into it. And then we got more excited as things are getting closer to a particular date. So
Yes.
today's episode, this part of our episode is brand new, the chat that Diane and I are having with you guys today. But the following rest of this episode will be snippets from particular episodes that we've already recorded. And I'll explain what those snippets are here shortly. But we are excited because it's now 2025.
Mm-hmm.
So in just one more year, there's two big events that are going to happen. One on a national level for our country and one on a state level for Colorado. So nationally, 2026, our country, the United States of America, will officially be 250 years old, which I know in the grand scheme of many of our countries around the
We're
world, we're still
babies.
babies. So to all our listeners in the UK and other countries that have existed much longer than us, yes, I know we're pretty young, but we're excited as Americans. I think a lot of us get excited about our history, sometimes in a good way, sometimes not in a good way,
Right.
but it's important to us. The stories that helped create our country are important to us. So that will take place in the same year in 1876,
1976.
Colorado,
August 1st to be exact.
August 1st, which is Colorado Day, and that's huge here. I don't know how many states celebrate their own founding day the way Colorado does, but August 1st, 1876 is when Colorado officially became a state in the United States. So our state will be 150 years old while our country is turning 250 years old. And this is where our exciting announcement comes in, or at least exciting to Diane and I. Diane, do you want to break the
Yeah,
news?
because it's going to be the Centennial state.
Yes.
So, like I said, we have been talking about this for 2 years. And I think 2 or 3 years before that, I created a Facebook page just called I Love Colorado History. And for everybody to share across from the state everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
pieces of history where not everyone is aware of. And we have so many people new to Colorado that Jennie and I have decided we are going to launch an I Love Colorado History podcast. And what we are looking at, of course, most of our history begins, I don't want to say ends in the cemetery, because honestly, it begins in the cemetery when you start research. Of course, we will be sharing cemetery stories, but we're going to branch out to include historical societies, museum, historical sites, and focusing on, not focusing, but definitely emphasizing the smaller ones who may not have all the resources available to them as the bigger cities would.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be pretty much a guest-driven podcast.
Yes.
So as Jennie said, we're putting the word out to everyone and anyone who is interested in sharing their community's history, events, and authors, just historians. I mean, it's the
All
game
through the state of Colorado. We want
yes.
Colorado is sort of, when you look at a map, rectangular in shape. So we're saying corner to corner to corner to corner, all the areas
Yes.
of Colorado. And like Diane said, we especially want to reach out to the communities, the counties, and towns that are smaller, that might have a little historical society. Maybe you even have a small museum. But again, unlike, Denver, where we have SCFD funds here that help to maintain our museums and fund a lot of our programs here, or even in Colorado Springs, where you
Right.
guys have some things set up. There's a lot of smaller rural communities, especially within Colorado, that don't have that. And people aren't as aware of their stories. And I think a lot of people, so obviously, we're expecting the majority of our listener base to initially be from Colorado, but I know there's a lot of people outside of Colorado who would love to learn more about our state. And
We
I
have
think
Colorado ties that have stories to share.
exactly, or they lived here for a time and they left,
Right.
or they had family here at one point or another. And this is a way to share those stories. So the new podcast, so this podcast, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, is not going anywhere. We will still be doing our weekly episodes, and we're still going to be covering all the cemeteries around the country, around the world. But the I Love Colorado History podcast is going to focus on all kinds of Colorado history. And we want to find, just like we do on this podcast, the unique individual stories that are not taught in the 4th and 5th grade when they start teaching Colorado history, those little tidbits of family history that people have shared. And both Dianne and I are Colorado natives, so we're passionate about our state. If you're watching us on YouTube currently, there's pictures of houses behind us. So Dianne, why don't you start with yours?
Okay, this is a house that's up in Chaffee County, and this is where my grandmother was. Oh, what did that happen? This is where my grandmother was born in 1896.
In the house.
In the house, and it's a family homestead.
I love it. I love that you have a photograph of it.
Yeah.
So if you look behind me, so my family came to Colorado a bit later. Mine came in the 30s. But if you look behind me, this house, this gorgeous, lovely log cabin was built by my great-grandparents. It's in Pueblo. It's my favorite house in the whole world. I've traveled a lot. I've been in a lot of houses. If I could live anywhere, I honestly would live in this particular house. I've always loved it since I was a little kid. I had my 6th birthday party in this house, actually. It's when I got my very first bike for my birthday. It was a yellow banana seat bike with a white basket on the front. That was important. So this house, yes. So my great-grandparents built this house. And originally, a lot of the furniture that was inside of it, they built as well. My grandfather was phenomenal at building things, and all of his sons. So he was my great-grandfather. One of his sons was my grandfather, and then of course my dad. And they all learned how to do woodworking, and they built the couches and the bed frames and all kinds of stuff that was in that house originally. And I love it. And so Dianne and I both have very strong roots in this state. And we want to find all our fellow Coloradoans who have the same types of roots and the same type of passion for our history. So obviously on the new podcast, we'll share some of the more well-known histories and stories as well. But we, again, really want to dig into the people of Colorado. There's so many different people who've moved to Colorado since before it became a state.
Right.
And we were just talking before we started recording, our history goes back, if we want to go prehistoric. We have lots of dinosaur fossils and dinosaur footprints and all that things here. And then there's all the Native American history that came before any of the European settlers came here. And then there's the gold rush history and all of the people that came from different countries. Mm-hmm. And we have all the Spanish history too, that comes up that's even earlier than the gold rush history. So all of that history is part of our state, and all of those stories make Colorado what it is in the modern sense. And we want to share those stories. So what we would like people to start doing, if you're listening now, and if you're a Colorado historian of any kind, whether you're like Dianne and I, and you just love history and you've been studying something particular, or you're working with the Historical Society, you work with one of the museums, you're an author, whatever. If you're interested in being on our new show, the I Love Colorado History podcast, you can email us on this show at our normal email address.
Yeah, the cemetery podcast email.
Yes. Yep. Let us know that you're interested in becoming a guest. We're going to start scheduling guests. We won't start doing any recording probably until about mid-June of this year, but we can go ahead and start setting up a schedule to get guests lined up to start recording. Our biggest goal is that by the end of next year, so 2026, is that we will have recorded at least 150 episodes to celebrate
the 150th
birthday of our state. So we're looking for at least 150 guests pertaining to Colorado history. And again, every part of Colorado. I don't care if you're in the northeastern corner, like up by Sterling and Fort Morgan, or you're all the way down south, near Durango and all of that border. It does not matter. We want to know all of the stories, all of the places, all of the people. We want to make sure that we're representing all of Colorado and
even if you're a genealogist and you have your family stories, I mean, please don't ever think, oh, they weren't anybody famous. They're the ones who made the famous people rich. They're the ones who made our state. So please don't. We want to hear these stories as well,
And
too.
even if you're not a genealogist or anything, but you know your family's history
Right.
and you
Right.
want to share and you're as passionate about that as Diane and I are, and you want to share your family's Colorado story and how they got here, we would love to hear it. There's so many different stories to share, and Diane and I come across them all the time when we're trying to prepare other episodes for this podcast. And then we're going, well, no, we've already done so many episodes about Colorado, so let's take a break because not all of our listeners are in Colorado.
Right.
But this will be our chance to be that Colorado cemetery. And we want, like I said, we want our guests from everywhere. So today, folks, instead of recording a brand new episode, we're actually going to be, after Diane and I sign off here, we're actually going to be playing snippets from all of the episodes we've recorded so far on this podcast that have to do with our Colorado history. So for our listeners who have listened from episode 1 all the way through now, you will have heard these before, but it's only going to be a portion from each of these episodes. It's not going to be a full one of the full episodes. If you're newer to our show and you haven't had a chance to listen to all of them, I will put in the show notes which episode numbers they are. So if you wanted to go back and hear the full episode about each one, you'll have the opportunity to do that as well, and you can pick up on that. And then next week, we will be joined by a guest who is going to discuss some fictional cemeteries with us. So next week's episode, it will be fun. I'm kind of looking forward to it. We've done this one other time. We did this early on when we did Act 3 of Thornton Wilder's Our Town. And that was definitely a fictional cemetery, but we were able to talk about how that pertained to it. This one happens to do with cemeteries that are in some video games that are based off of actual historical cemeteries, but are completely fictional and play to the game. So that will be our
that'd be cool.
Next week. Yeah, I thought, Charlie, my son, he will be our guest next week. This is a game that he plays, and he's been begging to talk about these cemeteries and how they relate to the world and not for a long time now. And I finally said, okay, we'll do that. You do the research and you tell me about it, because I don't play the video games, but he does. So it was like, we could do that. I think that'll be fun for listeners.
It would be fun.
Yeah.
I really do.
And then we have another special guest lined up after that at the end of the month. So it's just, we're already getting amped up for this year on this podcast with all of our cemetery stories and cemetery history.
And it's only the middle of January.
I know. And it's going to be another fabulous year here. But again, we are so excited to bring you in 2026. So we have some time. But again, It takes time to schedule people and get stories recorded and all this stuff done. So this is why we're announcing it tonight. But in 2026, then you'll get double the chance to listen to us.
Yeah, because it's not like we don't both work full time and have families.
And do theater and all the other things. Yeah. Which is why we were insisting on a guest-driven podcast for the I Love Colorado History podcast, because it will be much easier on the two of us if we only have to do research for one podcast at a time.
And the guests know their history much more than we do. So that's another reason.
Yes, but absolutely.
And we want people to be the ones that share their history, their place, because no one can express it and tell it like somebody who's involved with it.
Right. Yeah, especially when it's your own family story. And I promise Diane and I will share some of ours as well.
Of course.
I totally plan to, on that episode, go into more detail about this house and my great-grandparents who came and why they came to Colorado and all of that. That will be on that episode. I will say, though, there is the relation to cemeteries in this. My great-grandfather chose to be cremated, and his cremains are buried on the property there. So, that was his home. I mean, he built it from literally the ground up. There is a basement to it, and they started with that and built it up from there. So it's, like I said, my favorite house. And
just the ingenuity that they built the house and built it themselves. And
he was one of those, both of them were extremely hard workers, and they're good people.
I still think, because Jenny's family, great grandpa worked on the railroad.
Yep.
My grandfather worked on the railroad.
My grandfather also. So his son.
And mine was up in Salida. We lived also in Pueblo. Jenny and I were born at the same hospital.
Few years apart.
I remember the bicentennial in 1976. In fact, I still have a costume my mother made me. I have yet to see if I could put it on, if it would still fit. And I don't know if it's a good thing that, oh, it better be a good thing if it still fits. I
wasn't born then, but my husband was. He was born that year.
So I have at least one up on you this time for being all, I remember the bicentennial.
Yeah, I wasn't alive yet for that. I wasn't even in consideration yet.
So who was Jimmy Carter president for the bicentennial? I think he was.
That was 76. He might have been, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, pretty cool.
So, yeah. So anyway, folks, thanks for indulging us today. Yes. Enjoy the following episodes here. Like I said, these are snippets from episodes that we've recorded about Colorado history and our Colorado cemeteries. So far, I'm sure we'll do plenty more going forward.
Yes.
But we would love to hear from you. So the email address is the ordinary extraordinary, or it's just
ordinary extraordinary cemetery at gmail.com. I had to think, because I never email. I don't email you.
I know. And we just give the website address, which you can go through our website as well. I'll link it all in the show notes for you folks, but please enjoy this following episode, and we'll see you next week. On May 6, 1859, a hopeful man by the name of John H. Gregory discovered gold in the snow-covered Rocky Mountains in what is now the state of Colorado. In the months that followed his discovery, thousands of men, and some women, flocked to the area with hopes of striking it rich.
The towns of Central City, Mountain City, Black Hawk, Nevadaville, Missouri Flats, and many others were soon formed as more discoveries were made and the mines began dotting the mountainsides.
One of the men who came was a Cornish miner named Hugh Champion. He, like hundreds of other tin miners from Cornwall, England, was looking to improve his fortunes so that he could marry the love of his life and give her all the best things gold could buy. Cornish miners were highly sought after, as they were considered some of the most skilled and knowledgeable miners in the world. Times were tough in their English communities, so hundreds and hundreds booked passage to America to work in its western territories.
In 1861, Hugh left his sweetheart, Lavinia, behind in England, promising to send for her when he had saved enough money. Lavinia was relieved because they had argued about his going to America right after he left, and she thought perhaps their engagement was over, but she never gave up hope.
After the long journey from England and then across America, Lavinia Perry arrived in Central City on September 26, 1863. She was lovingly greeted by Hugh and a number of other locals as she was ushered into the home of a well-to-do young widow, where she was able to freshen up and change into the wedding dress she had made before leaving England.
When Lavinia was ready, she was taken to a small clearing outside where townspeople sat on benches and Hugh and a minister waited for her. Traditional Cornish songs were sung in celebration as Miss Lavinia Perry said her vows and became Mrs. Hugh Champion.
However, as gold, silver, uranium, and other precious metals were discovered in other parts of the Rocky Mountains, the towns of Gilpin County began to fade. Some communities disappeared altogether, and the people living in them moved on to bigger and better prospects. Many even took their houses with them. By the time Pete Redmond began working in the mines, it was no longer the same sort of lifeline it had been for the 2 or 3 generations before him.
In 1917, mining came to a grinding halt as men were needed to fight in World War I. After the war, some men returned to their mining communities to take up work once again. But it was nowhere near the numbers these communities saw in the 1860s and 1870s. In 1919, prohibition caused many places that depended on the sale of alcohol to close down. This included saloons and brothels in and around Central City. For a time in the 1920s, bootleggers tried to use some of the abandoned mine shafts as a place to make and store their moonshine. However, the sheriff at the time began burning those places down in order to prevent such illegal activity.
Pete Redmond was very much aware that mining was a difficult, dangerous, and not necessarily profitable job. He was also extremely observant and took to his pen writing poetry about his and others' experiences in the mines. Some of his poems even brought back folklore that came to America with miners from England. Cornish miners believed in little beings called Tommyknockers. These were goblin-like creatures that lived deep in the mines and caused bad things to happen to miners when they worked underground. There were also sprites who worked alongside the Tommyknockers that were called kobolds. Here is his poem simply titled Tommyknockers. When a miner journeys downward where no other man can see, the Tommyknockers waken and kobolds dance with glee. For maybe one that goes below will not come up again, and they can drag him deeper to the blackness of their den.
In a shaft below the collar where he drops from sight of man, a miner never knows just what the Tommyknockers plan. They loosened tunnel timber and slabs in airless rays and double-time the timers to end a miner's days.
Some miners ride the bucket and others ride the bell, and each one hoping mutely that the cable doesn't fail. The hoistman lowers slowly and miners pass from view. The Tommyknockers waken and the devil gets his due.
It's time to leave the site of such a gruesome death and head north to Littleton, Colorado, and a visit to the Littleton Cemetery. In this cemetery, you will find many graves of pioneer settlers that came to Colorado to mine for gold and eventually settle on the plains, either because they became wealthy from the gold mines or because they discovered other ways to make a living. It is hard to give an exact date of the founding of this cemetery, as it is believed there were burials that took place there before it became the official burial ground. The first recorded burials took place in 1869. In the older section of the cemetery are many stately stone and zinc monuments. There is a flagpole on the northeast side surrounded by headstones of Civil War soldiers. It is a cemetery that is still in use today. As you wander along among the rows of monuments, you will come across one bearing the name of Alfred Packer.
There is a historical marker next to his grave that reads, Alfred Packer was born January 21, 1842, in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. He served in the Union Army during the Civil War and was discharged in June 1863 for epilepsy. Packer went to the Rockies and worked for the mines for 9 years. In November 1873, Packer and a party of 21 left Utah for the Colorado Gold Country. They were advised by Chief Ouray that they should postpone their expedition until spring due to winter weather. In February 1874, Alfred Packer and 5 other men headed for the high mountains against Ouray's advice. The group became snowbound by a blizzard. Alfred Packer emerged alone from the mountains in April. He signed his first confession, describing what had happened, and stated that one member had died and that he had eaten him to stay alive. Later, the others died of starvation. Packer admitted killing the last man in self-defense. In August 1874, the 5 bodies of the missing companions were found near Lake City, and Packer was put into jail. He escaped from jail and was not seen again until March 1883 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He signed his second confession and was taken to Lake City, where he stood trial and was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. In October 1886, the sentence was reversed to manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was paroled in 1901 by the governor and took up residence in Littleton, Colorado, where he became a model citizen. Alfred died on April 23, 1907, and was buried with a military funeral in the Littleton Cemetery. It was said that Alfred Packer became a vegetarian before he died. Dedicated by Al Packer, Chapter Number 100, 25 June 2016. The Ancient and Honorable Order of E. Clampus Vetus, 6021.
what's interesting, was watching an episode of Mysteries at the Museum, and they had actually gone to visit the museum in Saguache County. And there they had this pistol that they found not too far from where this was supposed to have taken place with Alfred Packer and those men. And what they said was that pistol may have proven what he said in regards to the killing being in self-defense. That's probably something that we will probably never know.
Although it's interesting that they have something that might help to prove his story may have actually been true. I wanted to start by sharing the story of Addison Baker, since his monument is my very favorite in the cemetery. The Baker Monument is topped by a huge white horse, and it is said to have been erected in memory of Addison Baker by his family because of his love of horses, which he raised. Addison Baker was born on March 24, 1818, in Rochester, New York. When old enough to marry, he married a woman named Charlotte Baker, and while they shared the same last name, there was no relation. In 1849, the Baker family moved to Racine, Wisconsin, where they lived until 1857. For the next 3 years, they traveled from Chicago to St. Louis and finally to Omaha, Nebraska. They left Omaha in February of 1860 and headed for Colorado, arriving in Denver on March 20th of that year. Once in Denver, Baker set up a 160-acre farm and raised some of the finest stock in the area. Eventually, age and poor health made it necessary for his son Nathan to take over the actual farm duties. However, Addison Baker did not allow his failing body to get in his way of investing in large amounts of Denver's real estate before it boomed.
Located on Baker's land was a medicinal spring that was used as a watering place for early Colorado explorers, John Fremont and Kit Carson. Later known as Baker Springs, it served as Denver's first freshwater supply, which Baker delivered in barrels to Denver homes. Baker was a member of the Society of Colorado Pioneers. He died on January 20th, 1884, at the age of 66. His monument was built by sculptor J. A. Byrne, and many will tell you that it is carved out of Italian marble, but it is actually sandstone. According to Addison's granddaughter, Lily Sebin, the horse is a life-size replica of her grandfather's Arabian stallion named Ali, but Byrne claimed to use another horse as a model. The statue is unusual because the horse has no saddle, trappings, or rider, and is the only one of its kind in a U.S. cemetery.
Nothing on the tombstone is historically related to the facts of the life of the person who was buried there. Well, this story progressed in bits and pieces. I can tell it in terms of the life of the woman, and Nukasi was a woman, you can't tell from the name. You can tell it in terms of her life and how her life progressed, but it came together in fits and starts because the information that I got came piecemeal. And in order to understand one piece of information, I had to have another piece of information. So the story fell into place in a very odd way. As it would turn out, this woman's original name, she was not born in 1837. Her real name, I wouldn't say real because identity is a fluid kind of thing for her, but her birth name was Anna Clara Brown. She was born in 1877 in Jackson, Michigan, to German immigrant parents. And in 1888, her mother, who was widowed and an invalid, moved the family to the Denver Bottoms, which were the slums that would flood periodically when Cherry Creek overran its banks. She appears in the newspapers being hauled before a judge when she was about 16 for bad behavior. She and her sister were both warned, and she was put in a reform school for a year in the House of the Good Shepherd as a reform school because she was leading an abandoned life. And her sister Laura was warned that she'd go there too if she didn't shape up. When she got out of the reform school, she hadn't really reformed. She pretty quickly married a pimp from the red light district on Market Street. His name was Charles Capps. And there's an interesting connection between him and your Riverside Cemetery podcast that I'll get to in a minute.
Yes.
That she was still underage, so that marriage was quickly annulled. And she took off for the crib districts in Los Angeles. What happened with Capps is that he was the lover of the sister of Richard DeMady, who was accused of murdering Lena Tapper, one of the 3 women who were murdered in the so-called Denver strangling case. And so Capps, who was her brief husband, saw the body after DeMady found her and was a witness in the trial.
In 1992, John Sharp, a native of Cripple Creek, wrote an article in celebration of Cripple Creek Centennial, Pikes Peak or Bust. The slogan hit the country east of the Mississippi like a welcomed wake-up call, offering untold riches at the turn of a shovel. Even though tens of thousands of people responded to this call in the late 1850s and headed to the newly opening Colorado Territory, the irony was that none of the riches of gold and silver were found near North America's most famous peak, Pikes Peak. It was 30 years later when a cowboy by the name of Bob Womack, who had more faith than sense, persisted in telling folks that the dull gray silver metal in the rock along Cripple Creek contained gold.
Bob Womack came to Colorado in 1876 and purchased the Welty homestead west of Pikes Peak in order to ranch on the valley among the peaks. He named his new home Poverty Gulch. He also had a small knowledge of mining and felt certain there must be gold in the area, although many experts claimed there wasn't. In 1878, Bob discovered gold in the creek near his homestead. He knew that if he could discover the source of the gold, he could be a rich man. And for the next 12 years, he searched, sometimes more than he ranched, to the dismay of his family. However, he was at last rewarded, and on October 20th, 1890, Bob Womack filed a claim in Colorado Springs. He called it the El Paso Lode. The find essayed at $250 a ton. In today's money, that would be $56.87 million per ton. Yeah, I had to go find the math for that one.
Yeah, wow.
It wasn't until the spring of 1891 when others finally began to take Bob's claims of gold seriously. On April 5th, 1891, a man named Ed de la Vergne formed the Cripple Creek Mining District.
That summer, Bob convinced his friend, Winfield Scott Stratton, to come look for gold on this side of Pikes Peak. Stratton was not overly convinced that he would find anything, but he liked Bob and wanted to make him happy, so he staked a few claims in the new district and then returned back to Colorado Springs. He returned the next summer and staked another claim on the southeast side of Battle Mountain, about 6 miles south of Womack's Poverty Gulch. It was July 4th, 1891, and Stratton called his claim the Independence. The Independence was a big producer from the beginning, and by 1894, Stratton was proclaimed Cripple Creek's first millionaire.
At the turn of the century, 9 years after the discovery of gold, 500 mines were operating in the Cripple Creek district with an annual production of over $18 million. Some 8,000 miners created a monthly payroll of $900,000. At that time, more than 55,000 people lived in the district's 12 different communities. Cripple Creek, with a population of over 25,000, was Colorado's 4th biggest city and the business and social center of the Great Gold Camp. 8 newspapers were published in Cripple Creek. 5 of them were daily papers. The city had a stock exchange, 3 banks, 16 churches, and an excellent school system, and scores of clubs, lodges, and union organizations.
Bennett Avenue, the city's main street, was lined with fine department stores and shops that rivaled those of Colorado Springs and Denver. Much of the district's social life centered around the fashionable 5-story National Hotel and the opera houses that played to standing room only audiences night after night. Streetcars traveled up and down the principal streets. Every day, 9 long passenger trains arrived from Colorado Springs and Denver at the city's 2 depots over 3 different lines.
There were scores of gambling halls, and some 70 saloons never closed their doors. Many of them were down Myers Avenue, the big town's Sin Street. Several celebrities either grew up here or spent time in the mining district, including Groucho Marx, Lowell Thomas, Wyatt Earp, and Jack Dempsey.
All right. Well, my name is Ron West, and I started getting interested in, dead people in general back in about 2010 when I lost my job and had lots of time to hang out in cemeteries. I saw a big white mausoleum out there, started looking into who it was. Didn't think too much about it until I started reading a book about the history of Colorado Springs. Then I wanted to know more about that person that was buried in there. That happens to be James Ferguson Burns. And along the way, I found a very interesting character, a guy who made money, was rich, but shunned the upper class. Didn't want to be part of that because he came from a very working class background, and that's what he, that's who he was. And after that, I got invited to portray him one day. I did a lot of research and have been doing them ever since.
And do you want to give us a little more information on Mr. Burns or his outlook on life and kind of how you portray him when you do him?
Jimmy was, like I said, a very working class guy. He grew up in Portland, Maine, and he went a couple of different routes. He tried to be a lawyer. That didn't work. He tried to be a merchant seaman. That didn't work. And then he got a job with a manufacturing company. And he became a machinist, and he was good at it. And it took him, places up and down the eastern coast. Took him into Cuba and then into Peru for a while. And along the way, he discovered a little bit of, what mining was about. He invested in a coal mine or a diamond mine or something like that in Peru, made a couple of dollars out of that, but never made a career, never thought about it. Then he came back here to the States, ended up broke, and decided, let's go to Colorado Springs. It's a happening little town. Let's go check it out. His family was already heading out here too, so he had somebody to hang with. But while he was here hanging out, doing his plumbing jobs, his street grading jobs, his firefighting jobs, he decided to, actually he didn't decide to just yet, but he did, get kind of involved in the mining business quite accidentally. It wasn't something he wanted to do, but, through a little bit of luck and through knowing a couple of influential people, he ended up, along with a buddy, Jimmy Doyle, he found a mine up on the Cripple Creek mining district area on Battle Mountain and made some money at it. Where his story really begins is not just the fact that he built one of the biggest, most highest producing, mines there in the area, but where his story really begins is probably 1896, a few years after. His personality and the kind of person he really was started showing when there was a mine collapse up there in 1896. The NLE mine collapsed, and where there was 8 men that was lost inside the mine. His cohorts at that time decided that, they weren't worth recovering. They were dead. It's a grave now. Forget it. Let's move on. But he decided that wasn't good enough. And he spent a lot of money going in there and trying to recover these bodies. It really made his board members and his other shareholders very angry. But he felt that it was his duty to his workers to recover their bodies. It was his duty to his workers' families. After all, this was somebody's father, brother, son, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So he spent about $350,000 that month trying to recover these bodies. And because of that, he ended up missed paying out the April dividends for that month. And, for people who, like to have fun on that money, they missed it too. And they got very angry at him because of it. After that, he went about his daily business. Never mind. getting back to the mine, never mind the fact that when they were actually recovering the bodies, they discovered a new gold vein that actually paid out more money than what he spent. That was a moot point to his shareholders and whatnot, because they was like, well, you didn't give us the money you owed us before, so we don't like you
Oh my
anymore.
goodness.
So he was definitely a very, down to earth kind of guy. He actually stood there at the mine site most mornings, as he was saying goodbye to his workers, leaving, and saying hello to the new, shift coming in, and he knew every one of them by name. So he really did care about a lot of people. Then later on in 1903, 1904, there was a big strike. And this was pretty much the end of, his presidency at that time, because he never really officially stood up for labor, but he did pretty much stand up against the Mine Owners Association. They wanted their workers to work for, do an 8-hour day for the same kind of pay that they were getting. Not an 8-hour day. They wanted a 9-hour day for the same $3 that they had been getting. So working longer for, essentially
The
less
same
money.
amount.
And even though he did sign on to the pact that said that's what we were going to do, what he ended up doing was he kept his mine open and he paid his workers an extra quarter for that extra hour. So they got paid for it. And of course, like I said, that was going against the grain of the Mine Owners Association. But he ended up keeping his shop open by actually talking to the labor side, talking to the union reps and all that stuff. And he said, look, I'm not a union shop, but I'm not an open shop, or I'm not a non-union shop either. I am an open shop. I don't care whether you're a union or not. My duty is to the men who are working inside these mines and their families. Union or not, if they're not working, they're not putting food on the table. So that was his biggest issue was, I have to keep you guys working because that's how you support your families. And of course, that was a big bone of contention, not just with the Miners Association, but with the governor at that time, Governor Peabody.
So welcome, Jim.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
We are so glad to have you. So let's start with what led you to start researching the Leadville Cemetery and Leadville itself, especially since you don't actually live up there and it is a bit of a drive.
Yeah, so the journey to decide to do this research is just as interesting, I think, as the research, which is that I come from a large Irish Catholic family in Pennsylvania, and I was always told that I was Irish, but it never went farther than that. It was because my parents themselves didn't even know the history. They just knew that we were Irish. So when I became a graduate student and decided to pursue history, it was really largely because I was beginning to dig into my own roots and learn about not just that I was Irish, but what the stories of the people who are my ancestors, where they came from, why they came to the United States, what kind of work they did, what their lives were like. So I found an uncle who was sort of distant because we weren't in touch with them. There's kind of Irish grudges in the family. But he was so thrilled to hear from me, and he and I spent weeks and weeks in the 90s going around. This is before people used the internet for genealogy. So we would go to county courthouses and public libraries and church basements and just pour through microfilm and old church records, and we began to excavate who we really are, which is the most important question that I always ask my students in their education. Who are you? Or who am I? And so my Uncle Jack and I discovered that of my 16 great-great-grandparents, for example, 10 of them fled to North America during the famine. So I developed a really strong connection to that event. And I learned that they were railroad workers, factory workers, domestic servants, the hardest, most difficult work that there is. They were very poor,
Hmm.
and they fought. And as my uncle told me once, he said, "Jesus, Jimmy, all they had were their emotions." And I think that there's something to that they
True.
didn't have the currency of
Mhm.
financial wealth. They didn't have the currency of political power. So all they really had was the ability to escalate and emote and use that for leverage in their lives. And so anyway, that led me to a desire to research Colorado early or Irish and early Colorado history. And every source I looked at pointed me in the same direction, which is Leadville. Now, we were talking earlier about Central City. I did discover that Colorado's first large community of miners from Ireland, fairly large, was a place called Nevadaville, which is next to Blackhawk in Central City. And there were a couple of hundred Irish immigrants there in the 1860s and early 70s. But when the silver boom in Leadville exploded in the late 1870s, that became the place. So much so that by the early 1880s, I estimate there were around 4,000 Irish-born people
Wow.
living just in Leadville, the Leadville vicinity, and
Wow.
a fair amount of second generation as well. So my estimate is that about a fifth of the entire town was Irish. And it was the largest Irish community between the Nevada goldfields near California and in the
Hmm.
Midwest. Place like Kansas City, so between Kansas City and the Nevada goldfields, Leadville was the largest Irish community.
Wow.
So I was lucky because no one had really dug into this previously, and I was thrilled. I would go up to Leadville for weeks at a time, and the Catholic Church there. This is before they digitized anything. They just gave me their books, their records, and I developed their trust. So they gave me a key to the rectory, and I
Oh,
slept on the
nice.
couch and spent my days pouring through these church records. And
So
it was like
wonderful.
I was an explorer on a planet that had never been explored. It was thrilling for me. And in the midst of doing that research, I made some friends in Leadville. And one of my friends, who still to this day is a very dear friend, Kathleen Fitzsimmons, she grew up. She didn't grow up in Leadville, but she has 3 generations or 4 generations of family there, and she's lived there most of her life. She took me to Evergreen Cemetery, and I remember that day. I wasn't very excited. I thought I was just going to see a normal cemetery with lots of headstones, and she took me to the back to the pauper section, and I was stunned to see sunken, unmarked graves that stretched for acres, and a pine forest just went on
Hmm.
and on and on, and it was eerie and it was moving because I knew that the people who I was reading about in the records, most of them were buried there, and I left that cemetery that day committed to making sure the voices of the people there would be heard. Anyway, that's when I began my career at CU Denver. Life got busy, became a father, and then about 5 years ago, a friend of mine called me up and he said, "You know, Jim, that cemetery in Leadville where the Irish are in the unmarked graves." I said, "Yeah." He said, "We have to tell the Irish government about this." And I said, his name's Michael. I said, "Michael, why would the Irish government care about these people in unmarked graves?" So before I knew it, he had emailed the Irish Consular General, which is just a level below the ambassador, the one that
Wow.
represents the Southwest, CC'd me on this very aggressive email demanding that this Irish official, come to Leadville and see this cemetery where all these Irish people are buried. To my surprise, it worked, and this
Wow.
Irish official came. This was again almost 5 years ago. It was October of 2016, and we took him up there. We had a big series of events in Denver and Leadville, and he was very moved by this and began to set in motion the process that leads to where we are today. 2 years later, the Irish ambassador to the U.S. came to Leadville to see this cemetery, and
This is so cool.
with his wife, and we walked them through the cemetery, and they were quite moved. It's hard to be there and not feel some sort of emotion. So
Right.
since then, the Irish government has donated close to $80,000 to this memorial.
Oh, wow.
Just a few miles from Greenwood Cemetery is the Colorado Territorial Correctional Facility, which began housing prisoners in 1871. Within a few short years, the inmate population of the prison grew quickly. It became apparent that a final resting place for inmates not claimed by family members would need to be founded. In 1878, the Department of Corrections bought a plot of land in the northwest corner of the cemetery for this purpose. In 1933, a second plot was purchased in the southwest corner. In both sections lies approximately 600 inmates, but only about 350 have been located by markers. Metal plates made at the prison tag plant mark some of the graves, and a few others have stone markers.
Most of the graves in the upper or newer section are marked with the names and dates of death of the inmates. Most of the lower or older section graves are marked with a plate simply stating CSP inmate. A map exists for the upper section, and it is known where all but 8 bodies lie. These 8 are marked as unknown on the map. There is no map for the lower section, but because of meticulous record keeping by the Department of Corrections in a death book, it is known who is buried there, just not exactly where.
The name Woodpecker Hill came from the wooden markers that used to mark the graves. Ravenous woodpeckers attacked the wood with abandonment, and most are gone now. The first inmate buried at Woodpecker Hill was James Hill, inmate number 36, who died on January 28, 1874, of heart trouble and consumption, better known today as tuberculosis. He is one of the unknown burials in the lower section. The last inmate to be buried on Woodpecker Hill was Ben Edward Bevins, inmate number 23,005, who died on May 22, 1971, from cancer of the right lung. His grave is in the top section and has a marker. All inmates executed by hanging are in the lower section, and those in the upper section died by gas in the gas chamber.
After the last burial on Woodpecker Hill, Skyline Correctional Facility in the East Canyon complex off of Highway 50 opened a cemetery behind the facility. It is a small area with enough room for perhaps 25 graves. Only 7 are buried there, 5 marked with names and dates, and 2 with the markers missing. It is a quiet little cemetery that overlooks the mountains and is well maintained by the correctional facility.
In 1972, the federal government stopped executions in 30 states, Colorado being one of them. About this time, the burials ceased, and a question was raised as to what was done with the bodies of the inmates not claimed by family. An employee of the Wilson Almont Mortuary in Canyon City, who had worked there since 1978, explained that the prison had contracted with them and Holt Mortuary to have inmates cremated at state expense. To his knowledge, all of the ashes have been claimed by family members or a family representative.
One of the most beloved and well-remembered sisters is Mother Pancratia Bonfie, who lived from 1852 to 1915. Mary Louise Bonfie, born in St. Louis, was the daughter of Protestant parents who had her educated by the Sisters of Loretto. She was also the niece of Frederick Bonfy, founder of the Denver Post. She joined the order at age 14 and was assigned to teach in Denver. By her 30th birthday, she had been appointed as Mother Superior of St. Mary's Academy. In 1891, Mother Pancretia Bonfy found support from local bankers and businessmen, and the Sisters of Loretto founded Loretto Heights Academy in Denver, a Catholic elementary and secondary school for girls in order to accommodate boarders from St. Mary's Academy. In 1918, Loretto Heights Academy became Loretto Heights College, a degree-granting institution for young women. 2 years before the 19th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Loretto Heights College continued until 1989, when the 70-acre campus was deeded to Regis College. Teaco University purchased the college that same year, and it remained in their hands until 2018.
Mother Pancretia Bonfy and the other sisters worked with architect Frank E. Edbrook and Company to design an 86-room Romanesque-style main building, which opened in November of 1891. And he was the same architect who designed the Brown Palace Hotel, I believe.
Oh.
Same guy. He's very popular here in Denver at the time. He did a lot of work around the city. The walls were constructed of heavy red sandstone, and the irregular plan of this imposing 3-story structure included a raised basement and an attic level. The gabled roof with multiple dormers was steeply pitched. The main entrance was graced by a center tower rising to a height of more than 160 feet. The building has been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1975, and it is a beautiful, beautiful building. In the decades that followed, an additional 19 buildings would be added to the campus. Once it became a college, it offered courses in teaching, nursing, business, and even dance.
In 1912, the sisters established Loretto Heights Cemetery, adjacent to the school grounds, as a sacred burial place for their deceased community members. In 1898, one of the sisters had been laid to rest on this property. But between that time and 1912, 11 other sisters were buried in Mount Calvary, the Catholic section of Denver's original city cemetery. Those who live in or are familiar with Denver's history will recall that the city cemetery is now Cheeseman Park and the Botanical Gardens. By the 1890s, Denver residents chose to use other locations such as Riverside and Fairmont cemeteries, and the city cemetery was no longer a burial ground. This new Loretto Heights Cemetery would be used as a sacred burial ground for the sisters until 1969, when it was decided that future burials would take place in Mount Olivet Cemetery, in a plot near the grave of Bishop Joseph Matchbuff, the man responsible for bringing the sisters to Colorado.
So the women doctors, basically the whole story, this whole rabbit hole I've gone down began when I was researching another subject, which was the first major murder trial in Colorado Springs. And I came across an obituary in the newspaper. And I asked the people at the library, I said, "Do you know this lady?" And they go, "No." I said, "Oops." So
I love that.
So I started with her, and that was Julia E. Loomis, which the more I delved into her life, the more I wanted to know not only about her, but the other 3 women doctors who were in Colorado Springs prior to 1880. But she's the one that started it all here for the Colorado women doctors.
Oh, that's so awesome.
And what is most amazing about her for me, she was born in New York in 1816, and she did not attend medical school until 1869 when she was in her 50s.
So after her children were grown, yeah.
Well, she only had the 2, and she lost the one, and she lost some grandchildren. But she went to medical school, excuse me, and graduated in 1870. Two of the other women doctors that were here in Colorado Springs also graduated from the same college, which was the Cleveland's Women's Homeopathic Hospital School. I always turn that around because it's a big, long name. And they graduated in 1871. And then the fourth doctor, who was actually in Manitou Springs, was, excuse me, Harriet Leonard. And she went to the Keokuk School of Physicians and Surgeons, which was actually a co-ed school and had been from almost from its inception, because it became part of the University of Iowa. University of Iowa became co-ed in the mid 1800s. So okay, by default, she went to a co-ed school. And those were the first four that were here in Colorado Springs.
Wouldn't it have been fun to have had some sort of recordings?
Oh, yes.
Of William Palmer, so you could hear him speak. But yeah, I think you're right. He obviously was fairly sophisticated in his ability to engage with captains of industry.
Right.
Some of the things he learned and he brought back is, for one thing, he learned about gauges of railroads. The gauge is the distance between the tracks.
Right.
And in England, he saw gauges everything from 2 feet to the standard 4 feet plus. We could talk about where that comes from, but we'll that would divert us into Roman times if we did that. But he recognized the different options that were available. He also learned about coal as a fuel. And that became a very significant part of the railroad industry when he returned. He returned to the United States, went to work for the Pennsylvania Railroad, a fellow named J. Edgar Thompson. And one of the things he introduced was the use of coal as a fuel. At that time, all steam engines burned wood, which meant they had to chop down trees and chop that wood up and put it in the tender and create the steam and move the engine. Well, he learned that you could actually move a train for about 1/3 to 1/2 of the cost using coal.
Wow.
Plus, you didn't have to chop down the forests.
Mhm.
And at that time, they were discovering in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, that region, there was tremendous coal deposits. So it was a readily available fuel. So that was probably one of the first things he brought back from England. I would say was one of the most significant ones is using coal as a fuel for railroads.
So he really probably helped sort of develop the coal mining that happened in Pennsylvania and West Virginia.
Well, it certainly contributed to it because it did two things. Number one, of course, coal was used for many other things, obviously heating homes and factories, but in the course of using it for the railroad, not only was he able to use it as a fuel, he was able to transport the coal to places where they didn't have those tremendous mines and resources.
That's amazing. Again, he was so young when he started figuring all of this out.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. I look at some of the young people today that we have. We don't see them quite as much because there's so dang many of them. But there's some pretty industrious and inventive young people today that I'm pretty impressed with. But Palmer's life got disrupted in the 1860s. There was a thing called slavery in this country. I think we've heard a bit about that today. And, he certainly, as a Quaker, he adamantly was opposed to slavery.
Right.
And of course, he was right on the borderline of the slave and free. I mean, the Mason-Dixon line was between Pennsylvania and Maryland. He knew what was going on there.
Right.
And when the North, the Congress was moving to outlaw slavery, and the South said, no, no, you're not doing that. We're leaving. And of course, the Civil War broke out. And he had to dig into his conscience a little bit because he was a Quaker.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a Quaker, adamantly opposed to war. But on the other hand, as a Quaker, he was adamantly opposed to slavery, shall we say. And so he chose to go to war, and he had a pretty outstanding military record. He was stationed right there along the border between North and South, letting excursions into the South. One of his roles was to defend Washington, D.C. because, as you know, Washington, D.C. is right on the border there.
Right.
Subject to attacks. He was a spy. He often put on civilian clothes and went into the South to find out what was going on with the troops there. And at one point, he got captured and put into a place called Castle Thunder, one of the worst prisons in the entire war, actually.
Yikes. I do have a quick question.
Yes, go,
because
please.
we
Thank
learned, well, I was just thinking about it. We learned from Bob last week that Palmer himself was a Quaker, but also a very strong abolitionist. And it was his abolitionist side of him that made him decide to go ahead and fight in the Civil War because he really wanted to get rid of slavery. And so it went out over that. Now, I'm asking this, and I don't know, maybe you don't know the answer, but Queen being from Kentucky, which is a southern state, do we know what side? I mean, her father was involved. He didn't fight in the war. He went to work under Lincoln. So I'm assuming,
yeah,
they would have been on the Union side of things.
On the Union side, because then they did, once he moved to or got appointed in Washington, they actually moved to Flushing, New York, where that's where she grew up. So their time in Kentucky was very, very brief.
Okay.
So
sorry, I just wanted to, I thought about that. I was like, oh, you said she was born in Kentucky, which would have been a southern state, which could have had a conflict there, but I guess not.
Oh, no. They were very much unionist. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Very much a military background of the family from almost the beginning of our country, which is another thing that people don't realize, that they have very deep American roots.
Love is in the air, since it is Valentine's Day. And this year we thought we would share the story of a woman who led, shall we say, an unconventional or alternative life as a madam in the Wild West. And despite her unconventional path, found love and respect among many in her community, and her final resting place has not been forgotten. Today we travel to southern Colorado and the mountain town of Durango, one of my favorites. If we follow a short winding road just east of town, we come to Greenmount Cemetery, established in the early 1900s and situated so that it overlooks Durango below.
And as you can see behind me, that is the front gate of the entrance into the cemetery. Not far from the main entrance, you will come to block 27. In one of the patches protected by large, lovely shade trees is a small red and gray granite marker simply inscribed Frankie Ferguson, 1861 to 1937. There's nothing to indicate this woman's story, but it was said of her that she was one of the sweetest women you ever met in your life. She would do anything for anybody to help them out. She spent most of her adult life in Durango, and up until about 1920, she was known around town as Madam Bessie Rivers. Her life began simply enough when she was born to Iowa farmers, Horace and Hannah Stewart, most likely between 1861 and 1863. Most census records list her date of birth as 1862, but there are some that say 1865 and one that lists 1877. Her parents named her Frances,
but it seems she was called Frankie. There was only one other child in the family, another daughter named Cora, who was about 2 years older than Frankie.
And we're going to talk about a little bit later how honest Bessie really was. But it seems like age was not something that she felt she needed to be honest about regularly, which I think is why there's a discrepancy in records, especially that 1877 one, because she would have been on that particular census record, and I can't remember what year it was, but she would have been closer to 50 by the time she did that particular survey. So my guess is she didn't look that old and decided she wasn't going to be that old on official records.
Well, it's okay for a woman to lie about her age.
Right? I figure of all the other things, that's, she can get away with that one. First, we will introduce our guests. So we have Shelby Carr joining us today. Shelby actually heard our first episode that we did about Louise Hill, and a little bit, we also covered Margaret, or otherwise known as Molly Brown, in that same episode. We kind of gave a background of both ladies, and we did talk about, and we probably helped to perpetuate some of the myths about the two ladies in that episode. So Shelby's going to help clear some of that up for us. But she works as the membership manager for the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York. But she actually went to school here in Denver and received, or part of her education when she was doing all her stuff through school, she actually studied Louise Hill. And so she really learned who this woman was. And so I was super excited when she reached out to us. She actually wrote a book called The Queen of Denver, which is all about Louise Hill. So that was Shelby's first book, if I'm correct, if I remember that right.
Yes.
And so we are super excited to have Shelby joining us to correct the things we got wrong about her in our first episode, but also to even go into more in-depth information on her, because there's a lot that we didn't cover either for time. So welcome, Shelby.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about Louise and sharing her life story. As you mentioned, she's a passion project of mine, and studying her life has sort of taken over my life for the past few years. She and I found each other, I like to say, in 2016, actually, when I was working as an intern speech writing at the Colorado State Capitol. I was researching Colorado women to use for our Women's History Month breakfast. And I stumbled across a Colorado Encyclopedia article that said Margaret Brown would be remembered long after Louise Hill would be forgotten. And that really struck a chord within me, because I really didn't know much about Louise Hill at that point. I had just started graduate school that year, and I did a bit more research. And of course, all of the things I read were so scandalous, right? I did actually a historic walking tour of the area as well, and the tour guide called her a bratty cheerleader. I've heard her compared to Regina George of Mean Girls. Love the movie. Horrible comparison between the two women. And of course, it's always great to have the villain and saint story, right? Everybody loves, Saint Margaret Brown, who was such a wonderful philanthropist of her time. And of course, she has to have a rival. You always have to have the mean girl. But I think it's really important to understand that these women were actually human beings, and Louise Hill isn't just the villain in someone's narrative.
Right. No, and I appreciate that. And she really did. And we touched on it a little bit. It was hard to kind of find some of the information I was looking for, but she also gave to a lot of organizations and did a lot of charitable works. She didn't always want it written about necessarily, but she was not this complete, total bad guy that we sometimes hear she was.
No, she was absolutely a philanthropist in her own right. To name a few, I actually have a list, because this became a very common question where folks would ask after I gave these presentations. They would say, oh, she actually donated some of her money to charitable foundations?
Yes.
Well, yes, by gosh, she actually did. She actually said in an interview once, I believe it was with the Denver Post, that she would rather give her charities and her parties to the press, the so-called frivolous things in life, because her charities touch something closer and more sacred to her, because society was a game, right? At times for her, and charitable contributions and things of the like were not things to be played with to her. Those were actual things that were sacred to her. So she contributed to the Belgian Babies Fund, the Children's Hospital, the Church of the Ascension, Civic Benefactors Commission, the Denver Museum, Denver Orphans Home, Denver Post Children's Christmas Party Fund, the General Committee for the United Spanish War Veterans, National Liberty Club of Colorado, Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. She loved her alcohol. St. John's Cathedral, University Civic Theater at the University of Denver, and the Visiting Nurse Association of Denver, just to name a few for those who always ask. And she was a really, really big supporter of raising funds for family and soldiers in World War I. She was the Director General of the Colorado State Family Fund, and she saw donations as high as $2,000 a day, sometimes at the height of the conflict, which at that time was quite a sum of money. And they actually named an ambulance for her over in Europe called the Mrs. Crawford Hill.
So for our listeners who may not, we get new listeners all the time. So for our listeners who may not have heard our first episode, and I probably should have gone back to look which number it was, and now I don't remember which number it was. Can you give a little bit of a brief background on who she was, where she came from, how she ended up in Denver, because she's not originally from here, and how she ended up becoming the quote unquote queen of Denver's society?
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery and on X at OrdExtraCem. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.